All right, good evening. We are on the road today. We're on the road. Daf Yomi special edition. This is our first remote broadcast, right?
Since Sukkot.
I guess you're right, since Sukkot. Since our first remote broadcast since Sukkot. This is my office.
Nice.
And so we're...
Your computer there?
That's my computer. No, well, that's just whatever. That's my monitor. Yes, and my desk. These are my chairs. So we are remote due to the amazing Akiva Tats event, Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tats, taking place in Kahal Yereim. And we were proud to be able to find an alternate location. So if you showed up tonight expecting to be at Daf Yomi and you wound up paying an expensive cover charge to be able to see Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tats, I'm sure you're enjoying that event. It looks wonderful. But tonight's event here is also wonderful. It has sponsors for this evening. And it is free of charge, correct? Includes the cookies and sushi. And Daf Yomi for this month is sponsored by Jeffrey and Chava Bela Wald, Lilu Nishmas Jeff's father, Mr. Roman Wald, Avram ben Shmuel, Zichron Livracha, and grandfather, Mr. Menachem Eisner, Menachem Mendel, ben Mordechai, Zichron Livracha, whose Yortzites were on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, may their neshamas have an aliyah. And Daf Yomi for the month is sponsored by Shmuley and Miriam Fuchs, Lilu Nishmas Shmuley's mother, Beila Yenta Baschuna, Zichron Livracha, whose Yortzite is on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, may her neshama have an aliyah. We are on Daf Ayin Amid Aleph. We are at the Mishnah discussing the rules of the 5 grains as far as challah, chadash, and incidentally, we will get to matzah and the like, because why not talk more about Pesach since it's coming up? Hachitin v'asaurin v'hakusmin v'hashibol shual v'hashifon. The 5 grains are wheat, barley. Let me see if I get them in order. Kusmin is spelt. No, or kusmin is rye. Which one is that? Spelt. It's spelt. Shibboleth shual is raw. No, which one's rye?
Oats.
It's oats. I can always mix them up. Shibboleth shual is the oats, and shifon is the rye. Harei elu chayavin bechala. If you make dough from any of those grains, that's where you are obligated to take challah off of it. If you make of sufficient size, as we said, and you can make a multi-grain bread and also be chayev as well, and they mix together. Sourdough would be as well, right? As long as you make enough of it. Vasurim bechodosh milifnei haPesach, and you're also prohibited to use the new grains before Pesach, as we said, until they bring the korban omer. Mumiliktzur milifnei omer, and also you're not allowed to harvest those grains, right? Any of these grains can't be harvested until the omer as well. And im hishrishu kodem lomer, if these grains have taken root before the omer, haomer matiron, then even though they haven't been harvested yet, once they've already taken root, those grains are permitted to be eaten in the new year. Asurin v'im lav, but if not, asurin ad sheyavo homer haba. If not, then they are going to be prohibited until the next omer comes. You have to wait till next year, like the cubs. Tana, Tana. So we learned in the Gemara. Tana, we said, kusmin, that kusmin is min chitim. Kusmin, which is spelt, is a type of wheat. And shibol shual, which is oats. Veshifon and rye is min or are types of barley. So they're like subcategories. I'm not sure if that's scientifically, whether we agree that those are subdivisions or whatever, but they are of those divisions. Kusmin, so back to the spelt, so that is called gulba. They translate it also. I'm not sure gulba it means.
Gulba.
Gulba is gulba. It means spelt. Shifon, which is rye, that is dishra. Shibo shual, which is oats, is shibui tala. So those are the Aramaic names for those grains. So, honey in, these are the grains, these are the 5 grains. Orez v'dochan lo, but not rice and not millet. Those are not grains. Those are not grains. Minon immediately, how do I know that? Reish Lakish says, Asya lechem mimatzah. It is a gzera shava from matzah. Because we know that matzah you can only make from the 5 grains, and therefore from the word lechem, which is written by challah, and the word lechem, which is written by matzah, is lechem oni. Yeah.
Would it be like bulgur or something?
Millet and bulgur? Yeah, I guess that's...
Bulgur is wheat.
Is it?
Going by grain appears to be a slight misinterpretation of misspelling of bulgur.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. So, ArtScroll translates as millet.
Yep, they do.
That's right. It says over here, as far as chalav lechem arts, when you eat from the bread of the land, uksiv hosam, and it says by matzah, lechem oni. It is the bread of affliction. And so therefore bread, right? So therefore it has the same rules, 5 grains. The hosam gufa minolan. How do I know that matzah has to be made of those 5 grains specifically? Reish Lakish says, v'chein tana debei Rabbi Shmuel. Also, we learn in Brisa Rabbi Shmuel. V'chein tana debei Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Also, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov had a brisa like this. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Lo sochal alav chametz shivas yom tochal alav matzos lechem oni. You shall not eat upon it chametz. 7 days you shall eat matzos, the bread of affliction. Now, what does that mean? Dvarim, what does chametz have to do with matzah? I get it. Don't eat chametz and also eat matzah. Why put them together in the same pasuk? Dvarim habayim lidei chimutz adam yotze behen yidei chovaso bepesach. The answer is they're linked. The only way for you to be fulfill your obligation eating matzah is if you eat something that if you would have let it, it would have would rise and it would have become chametz. If it has no ability to become chametz, it can't be matzah. Yatsu elu, so that is going to exclude these, the rice and the millet. Shein bayin lidei chimutz, they don't rise and become chametz. Ela lidei sirachon, they just spoil, they just go bad. So we, of course, don't eat rice Ashkenazim, but Sephardim certainly can. There's no way for it to be, it's only rabbinically a problem because they were easily confused as grains, because you can make a lot of rice breads and all kinds of things that are very close to wheat, but it is not in fact a grain, and so therefore it cannot become chametz.
So the reason why we don't eat rice because it could be a chametz, and Sephardim have a different minhag, right?
Sephardim don't have that issue, right? It could be that was made together with and mixed in with flour that was wheat, and so therefore they just prohibited the whole thing, or whether the foods themselves could be easily confused, but in any event we have this kitnius issue, and we stay away from all of those things. But otherwise, not an issue. And you therefore cannot make matzah out of rice. You can't have rice cakes as matzah, right?
No, you can't even have corn matzah either.
Cannot have corn matzah, correct. Umitztarfin zeim zeh. And now we said that these grains can combine together. And you have, I've had oat matzahs, I've seen spelt matzahs. These are lots of, for gluten-free people, right? They have all these kinds, right? I don't know if I've seen rye matzahs. But you know, different grains, you can make them out of all the things, right? Oat matzahs are very expensive. Because I think that the process for making them not bitter is an expensive process. Anyway, Tana, we learn, you can find them in the stores now. Tana, we learn in a brisa. Tevua v'akimachim v'habetsekos, the grain and the flour and the dough, mitzarfim zevzeh, even all of those can combine together. Lamai hilchasa. So what halacha are we talking about that all of those things combine together? Amar Rav Kahana le'inyan chadash. Rav Kahana says, as far as the prohibition against eating chadash, right? If you're eating chadash that's made from some dough and made from some grains and some flour, you mix them all together, you can combine all of that together to make the amount that you would be in violation of eating for chadash. Rav Yosef Amar le'inyan chametz bepesach. Rav Yosef says, as far as chametz on Pesach, all of those things combined together, right? If you combine a kazayas of chametz from seeds of tevuah, seeds of grain, right? Which if you soak them, they will start to become chametz, right? Or flour or dough. You combine them all together to make chametz. Rav Papa says, linyan meiser sheini. This is as far as the halacha. As I don't know if they all have to be against each other. These are all different practical ramifications. Meiser Sheni, the second tithes that are supposed to be eaten in Yerushalayim. If you eat a combined kazayas of all of these things together, and they're supposed to be eaten inside Yerushalayim, then lucky, you can get lashes for the combination of eating all of them outside of Yerushalayim.
You're so lucky then.
Exactly. You actually will be lucky, right? Rav says le'inyan tumas ochlin. Right, as he says, I'll tell you what it's for. As far as the prohibition against the problem of tuma transferring to food. We said you need a certain volume of food in order to transmit tuma, an egg's volume. So we can combine the sizes of these different things together in order to get that volume. And this shows us so we're going to say that the grains and the flour is just like the dough. you might have taken a look and say, this is that if you just eat it by itself, that it's not food. It's not really edible. If you eat just grain or just flour, it's not like dough, which is something to eat.
If it's not edible.
Sorry?
Why would you want to eat it anyways?
Well, apparently it is. And so therefore, if you mix them together, right, so those things, well, he says that you have to, he says, that it means it has to have, the food has to be without any mixture of psolas, right? It has to be clear of bran, right? They would have bran is the chaff that goes on the outside that get mixed together. We think it's very healthy, right? It helps.
It's raisin bran for Dylan.
Right, but in fact, it's the chaff that you remove from the grain when you create the flour, the husks.
Yeah.
So therefore, also as far as tevua and the flour is concerned, right, you can't combine those together with the husks in order to create a volume for the beitza, for the eggs volume of tumas ochlim as well. Ve'atanya, but we learned in our brisa, chita, when it comes to eat, bein kalufa, bein she'ena kalufa mitzarefes. Whether you peel it or you don't peel it, right? It has that husk on the outside. The kernels, if you leave them peeled or not, right, it's going to combine together as far as the size of an egg's volume for tumas ochid. So how do you say that you can't count the husks? The answer is, but however, saora klufa mitzarefes she'ena klufa ein mitzarefes. But if it's barley, it has to be peeled in order for it to combine together. It's not considered edible until you peel it, because barley bran is lesser quality and it's not edible. So which is it? Is the husk part of is part in food or not? So the Gemara says, "Ini, is that true?" V'hatan de Rabbi Yishmael, we learned in a brisa from Rabbi Yishmael, al kol zera zerua asher yizareya. The pasuk says, any seed which is planted, that gets planted. What does that mean? Keder shebnei adam motziin lizriya. So we are going to be the tumas ochlim, the prohibition. I don't know. I can't get the words out tonight. The impurity, the tuma of food applies to anything which is a plantable seed, right? The way that a person takes it to plant it, right, which is that it is a kernel of wheat with the husk on it, and saora biklipasa, and barley with its husk on, va'adashim biklipasan, and beans or lentils together with their husks, you are going to also combine as kibetza. So now we've got really three different versions here. One said that we don't use the husks. One says we only use the husks by wheat, but not by barley. And now this one that says we always use the husks. So lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Ha bilachos, the brisa of the Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, right? So that is when you have wet, when they're fresh. When they're fresh, so then the seeds can combine together. Then the husks combine together with the seeds in order to be able to create. It's all soft and edible. However, the first brisa says when it's not is beyaveshos, when the husks are dried out. At that point, they're no longer edible. And so therefore they don't combine together with the food. So that's when they do and when they do not. Okay, next the Mishnah says, Vasurin bechodosh milifnei ha-pesach. You're prohibited from consuming any of these grains before Pesach, because it's before the Omer, and that's chodosh. Minani mili, where do we know this? That it's only these 5 grains. Only these 5 grains prohibited. So, Amar Reish Lakish, Asya lechem mimatzah. Also, Gzera Shava, bread from matzah. Okay, so it says, because it says by here, by the Omer, it says, V'lechem v'koli v'karmel lo sochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. The bread that is from the parched grain and the fresh grain, you're not allowed to eat it until this day, right? The day that you're bringing the korban. So it says lechem there, and then we learn lechem to matzah, just like we did by challah. V'liktzor lifnei Omer, you're also not allowed to harvest any of these grains before the Omer. Minani mili, how do I know that? Because Amar Rabbi Yochanan is asya rashis mechala. The answer is if Gzera Shava from the word rashis, which says it's the first from chala, and that is that by the korban omer it says vehevesim es omer rashis kitzirchem. You're going to bring the korban omer, which is the first of your harvest, and by chala it says rashis arisosechem, the first of your dough is chala terim truma. You're going to give it as a gift to the kohen. So it always, both of those are called rashis. So just like chala. Right, so they have the same rules. So just like challah, right, is only applicable by these 5 grains, so too the prohibition of harvesting is only applicable to these 5 grains. Now, my kodem la omer. So what does this mean? I think we have the Girsa adjustment here. The Girsa says, Kodem Lifnei Pesach, we change it. So I think we change it. So we're going to read it as Kodem La Omer, right? Rashi changes it to Omer, right? So what does this mean when the Mishnah says that the 5 grains are not supposed to be eaten before the Omer, right? We said, it says it could be Pesach, but it's not, because you're really not allowed to eat them before the Omer, because you can eat not these grains on Pesach. You can't eat the new grain yet, right? So Rabbi Yonah says, Kodem Ketziras Omer, it's before you harvest the Omer. Now Rashi explains, we don't literally mean the harvesting permits, but the time that the harvesting permits. So you're allowed to harvest at night, therefore the time that you can eat Chadash is first thing in the morning, right after the harvesting time. So Rashi aligns this with the opinions. If we remember, we had an argument, was it yesterday, Eli? Was it 2 days ago? The argument about whether you're permitted to eat the new grain in the morning or after the korban is brought, right? So this opinion is it's in the morning. And Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says, Kodem Havas Omer, it's when you bring the korban homer. So Rashi equates the Menachos. Rashi's Tosfos says that doesn't sound like what's going on. It sounds like you're allowed to eat at night, but we'll go with Rashi's for simplicity, right? It's a rehash of the previous machlokas, where we said that it was a question of Rav and Shmuel held one way, and Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan held the other way. So it's not, and we learned in the Mishnah, Asur b'chodesh lifnei Pesach, you're not allowed to eat the chadash, the new produce, before Pesach, ve'liktzor lifnei Omer, and you're not allowed to harvest the new grain before the Omer. So, Bishlama Leman Amar Kodem Havas Omer, I understand. If you're going to tell me that you're not allowed to eat it before you bring the Omer, so Hainu Delo Ka'orev Lehu Vitani Lehu. So the reason why we're separating these two things out, the harvest has a different date. The time you're not allowed to harvest and the time you're not allowed to eat are different times, right? You're not allowed to harvest. You can't. The first time you can harvest is the night after Pesach is over, and you can't harvest on Pesach. So you can't harvest. You can't harvest until before Pesach. That's the last time it's Pesach. So therefore, harvesting before Pesach you can't do. Eating even after the first night of Pesach is over, even the first day of Pesach is over, that night you still can't eat it. You still can't eat it the next day until you bring the Omer. That's why the Mishnah splits it up, because it says there's 2 different times. You have to stop harvesting. You can't harvest before Pesach, and you can't eat it before you bring the korban omer. So that makes good sense. El Amanda Amar Kodem Ketziras HaOmer. So, but according to the other opinion, that says that the harvest, right, that the eating this new that the harvesting, right, is only when we get to the is that night. And so too the eating is that morning is also the same time. So then li'arvinhu v'lisninhu. So they're really the same time. You can't harvest and you can't eat up until that night or the end of that night. So it's really the same time. Why do we have 2 different times listed in the Mishnah? Why before Pesach? It has nothing to do with before Pesach. So asur b'chodesh v'liksor lifnei. So you should teach it like this: asur b'chodesh v'liksor lifnei haPesach. Right? They have the same rule. You're not allowed to harvest or eat the chadash before Pesach. Because then once you get after Pesach, that night happens, and by the time you get to the morning, you're allowed to eat, you're allowed to harvest. Then they have the same time. Ella, so therefore, if you are Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda, Rabbi Yonah, have to have their machlokas explained differently in the Mishnah, from the Mishnah. Ela itmar aseifa itmar. If you're going to have this machlokas between the 2 of them, it's going to be the end part of the Mishnah. Shem hishrishu kodem laomer haomer matiran. It says in the Mishnah that if they started to take root, if the roots started to grow, so then before the omer, then the omer is going to permit that grain. So my kodem laomer. So what does this mean when the Mishnah says before the Omer? So Rabbi Yonah Omer, this is where the machlokas is. Rabbi Yonah says, Kodem Havas Omer. Before you bring the roots have to take place before you bring the Korban HaOmer. And Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda Omer, and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says, no, Kodem Ketziras Omer. The roots have to take place before you harvest the Omer, before that morning. So there's a slight difference of when the roots take place. It's even how you would know the roots took hold within that hour and a half between the 2, maybe, but it is that is the distinction. Amar le Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Yoshia didare, to Rabbi Yoshia who lived in his generation. There are multiple Rabbi Yoshias. So we want to be able to make sure we're clarifying, not the great Rabbi Yoshia that everybody normally talks about. He was talking to his buddy Rabbi Yoshia. And he says, Lo teseif akarech, don't sit down. We've had this language a couple of times. Don't sit down. Ad demifrosha slay laha. You got to explain to this. You got to be explaining laha mil. So you got to tell me, explain what this means. Minayin laomer shematir behashrasha. So where do we know that the omer permits whatever has taken root? Right? It doesn't say that. It seems like whatever omer you've got, whatever crop you have, the omer comes and it becomes permissible. We're in the top of Ayin Aleph Amid Aleph. So what is the source for the idea that it has to take root? So minalon. So he says, where is that from? Dichsiv, the pasuk says, aviv. The word aviv means that it is ripe. Right? So, lav mikal de'ika de lav aviv. So that means that the pasuk says that if you're going to bring a korban bikurim laHashem, it has to be the aviv, right? You have to bring the ripe kernels of barley to the Beis HaMikdash. So that means, if you're choosing the ripe ones, that means there exist other ones that are not ripe. So that means that non-ripe kernels are also permitted, but they're not supposed to be the one to be eaten, but they're the ones you don't pick to bring as the korban. Okay, so therefore you see there's unripe kernels. Okay, but unripe kernels does not mean it hasn't taken roots, right? V'dilma delav aviv uli olam de'ayil shlish. Maybe they might not be ripe, but the crop, the plant has already grown a third of the way. That's significantly after it's taken root. So Ella Amar Shmuel, so Shmuel says, there's another pasuk. Pasuk says, Me'achel chermesh. Once it starts to grow up in the field. Mlav mikal deka de lav bar chamesh. That means that there's another type of grain which has not yet grown up. And that's where we are permitting. So yeah, but v'dilma de lav bar chamesh, uliolam shachas. There's an earlier stage than bar chamesh. And that is, even if it hasn't grown a third of the way, it's shachas. Shachas is when it first sprouts, and it's food for animals. Because shachas is fodder, is the English translation, right? It's food for animals. It's barely sprouted and it's green, and for sure it's not ripe. For sure it hasn't grown a third, but still, it's not when the roots took hold. It's already growing. So Amar Rav Yitzchak is lav miklal de lav bar kama. So doesn't that mean, right? It says Amar Rav Yitzchak says kama. The pasuk says that it also means that you're supposed to bring it from wheat grain that is standing. Yet another pasuk. So that means lav mikal de lav bar kama, means that there's grain that's even earlier than that. So each one of these psukim moves the type of grain that it permits back earlier. So we're going to have earlier from the time that it pokes out of the ground. Yeah, but Dilma de lav bar kama uliolam agam. He says, what about, it might not be tall enough and be poking out of the ground, but it might be eligible only when you could take the top of the plant and bend it over to the roots. So you only need like this much out of the ground. So maybe that's where you're talking. That's later on than when it takes roots. Again, Elamar Rava says, pasuk says, Asher tizra, that when you plant it, Mishas Zriya, from the time that you plant it. And that means that when it takes root, that's the earliest possible time. And so therefore that's when this crop becomes permitted. Amar Rav Papa Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, ihachi, if that is true, right, if that's what you're learning from there, afal gav delo hishrish nami. Well, once you plant it then, it doesn't even have to take root. You just once it's planted. So Amar Le Sudani, he tells him, Sudani, you're a wise person. Bisadek, if it has to be in the field. So when do you plant it in the field?
Wise Alec.
No, wise person. This is a compliment. This is not a negative thing, right? From the pasuk, Sod Hashem li re'av, right? That is the secrets of Hashem are to those that are fear Him. So he called him Sudani. You're a what do you call it? A possessor of. That's correct. There you go. Yes. I don't know. I can't figure. My words are not coming out. Maybe it's the new environment.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Okay.
That's for sure what it is.
Okay. So
Maybe
I didn't have enough coffee. That's what it is. New Mishnah.
The standard you're missing.
Missing. There's just a lot of things.
You're missing the with your coffee. You're missing the coaster.
Okay. Next Mishnah. Kotzrin Beis Hashlach. Now we just said you're not allowed to harvest the grains, right? So before the Omer. But here's where you can. Kotrin Beis HaShlachin, you are allowed to harvest a Beis HaShlachin. A Beis HaShlachin is a field that needs to be irrigated, right? And so therefore its crops are inferior, would not be allowed to be used as the Omer, so therefore the prohibition against harvesting before the Omer from this field is not in existence. We're going to see why. Shepe Amakim, because in the valleys. Aval lo Godshin, but once you cut it down, you're not allowed to gather it up into bundles, right? Because at that point, as we said before, then people are handling it too much and people eat it, etc. Anshe Yericho, now you're going to talk for a while about these people from Yericho into the next page. Anshe Yericho, the people from Yericho, Kotrin Biratzon Chachamim, they used to harvest, and the Chachamim were okay with that, the way they used to harvest, because they had these kinds of fields, these Beis HaShlachin, and they didn't harvest, then it would ruin their crops, they'd lose it. V'godshin, and then they would pile it up. Shelo b'ratzon chacham. The Chacham did not like that they did that. But v'lo michu b'yadam, they didn't stop them from doing it. Right? They didn't stop them. We'll see why. Kotzer l'shachas. You're allowed to harvest the fodder, shachas, umachel l'behema, and give it to the animals. Why? Because that's not harvesting. Harvesting sounds like for human consumption. This is harvesting for animals. It's not a problem. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says Emasai, but I'll qualify that. When is that? Bisman shemaskil ad shelo hevi shlish. That's from the time it sprouts until it gets to be a third of the way grown. However, once it gets to be a third of the way grown, then you can't harvest it for animals, it seems, as well, which we'll see. The Gemara is going to discuss whether exactly what's going on here. Rabbi Shimon says Yiktzur v'yachil. He can harvest it at any point and feed it to his animals. Af mishevi shlish, even after it has a third. It doesn't matter. As long as you're harvesting it for your animals, it's not a problem. You just can't harvest for people. That's what the pasuk says. V'kotzrin mipnei netios. And there are other types of harvesting that are not really harvesting. You're allowed to harvest if you are saving the saplings. You've got some trees growing here and you've got some random crops that are growing around it. You can pull those out of the ground so that they won't impact the growth of the tree. Mipnei beis ha'evel. Also, let's say they had a custom. We don't do it anymore, but when you would come back from funerals, they would line everybody up. They need a big space to do it. So they'd line up in a field and give blessings to the mourner. And so it was, but that's what we do now. But there they had, there it was, did they quote it here? It's in Maseches Ksubas that they would have a film, other people would feed them, which we do nowadays. Right. In any event, yeah. So they would have some kind of they needed some space, and so they would do this outdoors. But now you need a field that you can clear the space out of. So if you want to pull the grain out of the field in order to be able to mow the lawn, right? Somebody pulls out the lawnmower and cuts it down in order to give you space. That's okay also.
But you might get the landlord upset.
You'd have to have permission, correct? You'd have to have permission. You can't just do it without permission. And mipnei bitul beis hamedrash. Let's say your Daf Yomi Shiur has no place to go, because right, and so you need to go find a place, and you go outside into the yard, and you want to pluck out the grain in order to be able, so that you can do that as well, because that's not harvesting.
We should have a Daf Yomi picnic one time.
It's on the agenda. Lo yaseh osan krichos, right? And you're not supposed to bundle them up. You're not supposed to tie them up. Aval manichan tzivasim, right? You leave them untied up. Mitzvahs ha'omer. Now back to the omer, right? The mitzvah of the omer is for it to come from the standing grain, right? Meaning that you're cutting it for the sake of the korban homer. You're not supposed to take grain you already cut and use that as the omer. Lo matzah. Now Yehuda had asked this question. What if you don't have barley? Right? He said that wasn't good. But what if lo matzah? What if you don't find any barley that's not harvested yet? So yavi mina amarim. Then you can bring it from harvested barley. Mitzvah so lavon min alach. It's a mitzvah for it to come from fresh grain. Lo matzah yavi yavish. But if you can't find fresh, you can bring it a little bit dried out. Mitzvah so liktzur balayla. Its mitzvah is to harvest it at night, but Niktzar b'yom, if you don't harvest it till the day, it's kosher, that's okay. And v'doches Shabbos, it's doches Shabbos to harvest the grain, as we said, that we even can cut it on Shabbos, right? But if there's no barley, the Yehuda, then we can't bring it.
It says you're allowed to do on Shabbos. That could be a malach on its own.
That's correct. It can be, and it is, and you are allowed to do it, as you are allowed to most korbanos in the base of korbanos that you are time obligated, right? So this is since this must be done today, so therefore it can be done even on Shabbos.
This is an exception for malachis.
As all of our korbanos are, as we learned, right?
And that you do it at night, could you do it like they don't have street lights, right? So
Yeah.
Like American highways, like the American highways.
You would need like
I know, it's interesting, right?
or something.
But it is a bright night because it would be the 16th of Nisan, which is the day after a full moon, right? So you've got.
True. Or the northern
So
lights.
you should have a little bit. You should have some lights.
Or the northern lights might light up the sky.
Not in Yerushalayim. No. Unlikely. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Binyamin says, "Kosav echad." Number one pasuk says, "Tzartzim es ktsira, vehevesim es omer." You're going to harvest the harvest, and then you're going to bring the korban omer. Ksiv, and then another pasuk says, "Reishis kitzirchem el kohen." The first of the harvest you're supposed to bring to the kohen. So ha ketzad. How do you fulfill both psukim? Mimakom she'ato mevi iata kotzer. There's a rule. That is, where you have grain that would be eligible for the omer, fresh grain, barley grain, that you're not allowed to harvest that until the omer, because you need it to be because you need the omer to be rachis. But if you've got lesser quality grain, then you can cut that down, as we had by the Beis Shlachim, because it's not eligible to be brought as the korban omer anyway. Ema miminsha tamevi iata kotzer miminshia tamevi ata kotzer. What about if it's not barley? What if it's wheat? So can I harvest the wheat because I'm not going to bring that as my korban omer anyway? So ahu lo motzis omer. That you cannot say. Mi de Rabbi Yochanan, which Rabbi Yochanan, because of what Rabbi Yochanan said, because Rabbi Yochanan just earlier today's daf had said that the rules of Ketzira apply to all 5 types of grain because he learned it from matzah. And so therefore the prohibition applies to all 5 types of grain, regardless of the fact that they're not the type of grain that you're going to bring this korban from. So that we don't say. Okay, now let's talk about these Anshe Yericho, these evildoers, or I guess they weren't evil.
Guilty.
They weren't evil. They were just doing things that they thought were okay, but they weren't. Anshe Yericho kotzin beratzon chachamim. They were harvesting according to the will of the chachamim. V'godchin shelo beratzon chachamim. But they were gathering it up. So man shmas le da'amar michu velo michu. Who is it when you start to see in this Mishnah that they were doing something with the will of the chacham? They weren't doing it. Who is it that criticizes and starts talking about these people from Yericho, right? That said that they were doing some things according to chachamim, some not. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda is the one who has a brisa that says similar type things about the people from Yericho. V'sava Rabbi Yehuda holds Ketzira d'Anshe Yericho beratzon chachamim havai. But I'll show you a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says that even the harvesting from the people of Yericho wasn't according to the will of the chachamim. So v'hatanya, we learn in a brisa. Shisha devarim asu Anshe Yericho. There were 6 things that the people of Yericho did. So this is now, you can see, it sounds like the stuff we're talking about. Shlosha beratzon chachamim. 3 of them the chachamim thought were okay. Ushlosha shelo beratzon chachamim. 3 of them the chachamim did not like. Ve'eluhain, here's the list. Ve'eluhain ve'elu sheberatzon chachamim. Here's the list of ones that the chachamim were okay with. Markiven dekolim kol hayom. Erev Pesach, we've got a lot of things to do. The chachamim said, don't do malacha. Don't start getting involved with malacha. We want you. We're not noheg this way now, right? But things don't want to get involved in anything that's going to distract from preparing for Yom Tov. So
except if you need wine, you can get on Yom Tov.
So now we don't have a minhag to do these things, right? But after Chatzos, they were supposed to get their korban pesach ready, and so no more doing malacha. Before Chatzos, they were. Now the people from Yericho were grafting their palm trees all day long. And that sounds like it's a malacha, right? This grafting, it's planting, it's a problem. They were doing it all day long. That's the first one. And they thought what they were really doing is they were injecting their trees with,
steroids.
It was like an injection that came from other plants, but it wasn't. They felt it wasn't really a malacha because it wasn't that strenuous an activity. Plus, it seems that their crops were already weak, so they needed to do this in order to keep their trees healthy.
When did that kill the plant tree?
No, the opposite. It's for the health of the tree.
So it's like a health injection.
Correct. And so that was not a problem. That was not a problem because the Chachamim, that was the Chacham said that's okay. Because you're right, it's not that significant and it's going to cause loss. So therefore that was permitted. The Korchin es Shema. They bundled up the Shema. What does that mean? So Rashi says that they didn't make a break between Echad in Shema Yisrael and V'ahavta. So it sounds like they didn't say Baruch Shem Kavod right, when they were doing it.
Right.
But
You have to repeat the Shema if they didn't say Baruch Shem.
I think it's Rav Moshe says that it doesn't seem like that's the pshat in the Gemara because everybody would say Baruch Shem Kavod. That wasn't even an issue. So therefore, even that it's presumed that maybe Rashi is saying that they didn't take a breath or a break between Echad and Baruch Shem Kavod, and then before V'ahavta, we're supposed to pause between each of those sentences in order to indicate that between. I was always told that one is from the Torah, one is from one is Baruch Shem Kavod is not from the separates one.
It's like you're blessing God's name.
So others comment that Korech Shema is that you were reading it and mushing the words together, right? That potentially you're not saying the words because there are lots of words where you put the letters together and you say them wrong. So those kinds, that issue as well. And the third one was Kotzrin Lifnei HaOmer. They were harvesting before the Omer, and they did all of these things b'ratzon chachamim. That was okay. They were doing them. They were doing them with. It was okay, right? That it was with ratzon chachamim. Ve'elu shelo b'ratzon chachamim. Here's the list of things that the chachamim did not like. Godshin lifnei Omer. They were harvesting and they were piling up their harvest. That they weren't supposed to do. Umatirin gamzios shel hektish. What they would do is they were helping themselves to the branches from their sycamore and what was the other type of tree? Sycamore, carob trees, right? Sycamore and carob trees. The story goes, shel charav v'shel shikma. That's right in there. I was trying to remember what it was. Shel charav v'shel shikma, the carob trees and the sycamore trees. What happened was their parents had planted sycamore. They live a long time. Sycamore trees and carob trees. The parents had planted them. You prune them every.
Carob or carrot?
Carob. Carrots do not grow on trees. So the carob and sycamore trees get pruned every 7 years. So what they did is they pruned the trees and then they made it hektish. And the thought was that they'll grow very large and big and you make beams, right? That's what it's for. They make very large, good for building large structures out of big planks of sycamore tree and of carob tree. But what these people would do is every 7 years when they trim the tree, the branches they would cut off, they used them for themselves. They figured the trunk of the tree is hektish, not the growth. So they were taking that. The Chacham said, "Nah, you can't do that, right? It's growth of hektish is in itself hektish. You can't do that." And the third one is portzim protzos begino sehen ubepardoso sehen, and they were also breaking in holes in the walls of their fields, right? Lahachil nesher la'aniyim b'shnei batzoras. It was the famine years, lean years, and there would be fruits that would fall off the trees. So they'd make holes in their fences so the poor people could come in and get it.
So during the famine year, the fruits, would they grow old and bad?
Well, every year the fruits grow old and bad, right? But first,
famine year, because there is nothing.
First they would fall, but the less would grow. You're right, but they were allowing the poor people. If that was a good idea, wasn't a good idea. But Shabbos and Yom Tov, not a good idea to do that on Shabbos and Yom Tov, because the poor people, if you came in and all of this stuff wasn't on the ground anymore, it had already been collected, what would they do? They'd climb the tree and get a fruit. Can't pick fruit on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Right. Therefore, the Chum were not pleased that they were allowing the poor people just to come in. They figured collect the fruit and hand it out to the poor people.
Were they chayav to get any lashes or anything like that?
No, this was just shalom. They weren't doing it. There's no avera. It's just not a great idea, right? Better that they should collect it and hand it out to poor people rather than to just open the gate and let the poor people in because they won't be careful. Devrei Rabbi Meir. That's what Rabbi Meir says. Amar la Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Im b'ratzon chachamim heinosin, you call adamosin kain." If you're going to tell me the first three things were the things the Chachamim liked, so then everybody should do those things, right? There's no isser. It's not like they were doing it, and everybody could do it. Ella, rather, elu ve'elu shelo b'ratzon chachamim. The lists, both lists, are things that the Chachamim did not want to do. But val shlosha michu chachamim. But on three of them, the Chachamim actually told them not to do it. Val shlosha lo michu biyadim. And three of them, they just said, we don't like it, but we're not saying anything about it. Okay. Here's the three that they didn't stop them from doing. Markivin de kolim kol yom. The fact that they were injecting their trees, right? Okay. They weren't thrilled with it, but they weren't so upset by it that they told them to stop. The korchin es shma. Right, they were bundling up the Shema. They weren't making space in the words. The kotzrin v'gochin lifnei Omer, and they were harvesting and gathering up piles before the Omer. Now, this is one that's going to be tricky because this sounds like, and this is what we're going to say. It sounds like they were harvesting and they were piling up. They were not allowed to do that before the Omer, and we'll see in a moment. The elu shemichu biyodam. These are the ones that they actually told them you got to stop doing. Ayin aleph on the base. Matirin gomzios shel hektish. They were shel char v'shel shikma, the branches of the sycamore tree and the carobs. They told them they can't do that. Portzin pratzos begino sehem ube pardos sehem kadesh laachil nishar laniyim b'shnei batzores b'shabos v'yom tovim. They told them to stop making holes in the walls so that the poor people could pick up the crop from the ground, the fallen items from the ground during the famine years. V'nosnin peya layerek, and they were also leaving the corner of their field for poor people vegetables. Now, that's a problem. Vegetables are not obligated because the only things in Peah, the Mesechus Peah, Mishnahs Peah tell us that only things that are stored for longer periods of time are obligated in the halachos of Peah, leaving them for the poor. Vegetables, you pick it and they go bad a week later. So those things are not obligated.
Actually, for Charlie, sorry, the only one that doesn't go bad so quickly.
Okay, it's good to know, right? Mm-hmm. So, but other vegetables, right, you'd not be obligated in Peah. Problem is that Peah, if a poor person picks Peah, he doesn't have to give Trumas and Meisers. Since it's Peah, you don't have to, it's a gift for the poor in the first place. It doesn't then have to have taken off and given to Kohanim and Leviim. If these poor people went into the field and took this leftover corner, they thought it was fine for them to eat. They didn't take off Trumas and Meisers. But since it's a vegetable, it's not. So they had to take off Trumas and Meisers, at least Midah Rabbanan, right? And therefore they were not doing that. They said, hey, don't do this. Pick the vegetables, hand it out to the poor people. Don't leave it in the field for the poor people. Okay. Now, Ulatamech. So now what happened is that Rabbi Yehuda says that they were harvesting before the Omer, which the Chum did not want to do. So how is it that in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda said that they were harvesting, people of Yericho were harvesting because they had a Beis Shlachin and it was fine. So which is it? So the answer is Latamech. Well, there's a problem because this Brisa has a bad text in the first place because it says Shisha, there were 6 things, but Shiva Havu. If you were counting, there were actually 7 things on this list, and so therefore, 2 were bundled together. Sami mikan ktsira, take the harvesting out of the list and then that solves all your problems. You're down to 6, and then it doesn't contradict the Mishnah. It just got bundled. The harvesting and the piling got bundled together. We can see why, because those 2 ideas go together. Therefore, that solves our problem. Okay, next. Kotzer l'shachas umachel behema. So the Mishnah says you're allowed to harvest the fodder, and you're allowed to feed that to the animal. So Tnan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah in Maseches Peah. Ve'elu mafsikin lepeah. When you have a field, right, you have to leave a corner of your field for the poor. And if you have 2 fields, then you have to leave 2 corners. How do you know if you've got 1 field or 2 fields? Right? You would tell one is way over here, one is way over here. But not necessarily, they could be right next door to each other. So there are certain things that if you have it in the middle of your field, it divides your field into 2.
Like a fence? Here's
some examples. A nachal, right? If you've got a ravine, right? Like a nachal is like a stream, right? A shlulis is a pond, right? V'derech hayochid v'derech harabim. You've got a private path or a public path, right? These are of 4 amos in width, but not up to 16. And shvil harabim and shvil hayochid, or if you've got a large path, which is greater than 16, for the public path or the individual's path, hakavua b'yomos hachamu b'yomos hagashamim, which is a set and established path, because during both the winter and the summer, because during the winter months everything gets muddy, but this is a real path, so it stays there. Vehabur, and if you've got a field that's fallow, right? You have a non-planted area. Vehanir, if you've got a section of your field that is plowed, and so it's not growing yet. Zera acher, or if you've planted another type of produce in the fields in between. Wheat here, and then onions, and then wheat, right? So the onions makes sure that you got two different wheat fields, okay? Then also, the kotzer l'shachas, also if you've harvested, and you harvest this when it was very low, for the sake of making it fodder for the animals. So that's mafsik, that separates the two fields. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's what Rabbi Meir says. Chacham says, ein mafsik. That does not separate. Elim ken charash, unless you then go back and you plow the field as well. Why? Because when you harvested it when it was low, that's just harvesting. If I harvest a part of my field, then you just began the harvest. It's not like harvesting separates between this field. I had one whole field, and then I harvested this part. So I still have one field. It didn't separate it into two fields. The only way to separate the fields is for me to plow the middle of it, so now it's two separate fields. That's the argument. When you harvest the shachas, when you harvest the animal fodder, is that a harvest, in which case the field remains one, or is it not a harvest? So that's what Rabbi Meir seems to imply, that it is not a harvest, and the Chum say it is. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Bar Chana says, and then Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir, B'shitas Rabbi Shimon Amra. Rabbi Meir, who holds that shachas, cutting the shachas, is not a harvest, he agrees with Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. De Amar Yiktzur v'Yachil af mishviya shlish. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon said that you're allowed to cut it down the produce for animals, right? As a shiches, even if it has grown already a third, right? Alma kasavar kol shachas lav ktsiru. As long as you're harvesting it for animals, it's not harvesting. Right? We're not calling it harvesting. We're just cutting it for animals, and therefore that's Rabbi Meir who says that separates the fields, and Rabbi Shimon who holds that's not a violation of harvesting before the Omer are agreeing.
You're cutting it down for the animals, for like animal feed or whatever.
That's correct. Okay, now Yosef Rabbi v'Kamer Lo Lahal Shmata. So Rabbi was coming and he was teaching over this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that Rabbi Meir in Maseches Peah holds like Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah, and he says Esvei Rav Acha Bar Huna LeRava. So Rav Acha Bar Huna asked Rava the following question: Achla Chagav. Let's say it says in Maseches Peah. Let's say locusts descend on the field, grasshoppers, and they eat a path through the field. So now you've got two different fields. Or kirsemuha nimalim, or ants attack the field, and they cut the crops down. And now you've got a bald spot in the field. Shavarta haruach, or wind blows and it breaks the crop, and now you've got a section of the field that's not good. Hakol modim, so everyone agrees, charash mafsik, that if you plow it, then it separates the fields. Lo charash eno mafsik, but if you don't plow it, it isn't. So hakol modim. So it says everybody agrees to this. So man, who's everybody? Presumably Rabbi Meir, right? Presumably Rabbi Meir is included in everybody. So now, Iyamart bishlama mas nisin. So I understand Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah, right? He says that harvesting, in order, the Mishnah in Peah says that if you harvest it, then it's going to separate the two fields. So bishalohe via shlish. That must be a circumstance where it isn't a third of the way tall yet. So then, brisa de charash in, lo charash lo. Then this brisa that talks about the grasshoppers eating, so it grew already a third of the way. And so therefore, just the fact that it fell down isn't enough to make it separate the fields unless you plow it. The only way to separate the fields is if you harvest it when it's less than a third. So hevi shlish, right? That would be when it grew a third. So that's the distinction. If it grows a third, so then if it gets knocked down, you've still got to plow it. If it didn't grow a third, you don't need to plow it. Then we're consistent according to Rabbi Meir. But Ella Iyamart, if you're going to say Masnisin Nami B'Shevi Shlish, that our Mishnah in Peah is also talking about when you harvested it for animals and it grew a third already. So Hashna Mahasam Katsira de Adam, if you can tell me a human being came and they cut it down, that doesn't separate your field. So then Amar Rabbi Meir Lo Shma Katsira, he says that's not going to be a harvesting. So Hacha Kolshkin. Of course, it's not considered a harvesting when the wind blows it down. So therefore, the only distinction between the Mishnah and Brisa must be how high it grew. Well, that means Rabbi Meir must be holding that the only way for it to not be a harvest is if it's less than a third, which means he cannot be agreeing with Rabbi Shimon that even if it's more than a third, it's not a harvest. So Ella, Rabbi Meir, be shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra. So therefore, we're going to say Rabbi Meir is actually Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, right? Rabbi Yehuda says, Domer, he's the one who says, E Masai, when is it that we hold that your crops are not, that there is no prohibition of harvesting? Bisman shehischil ad shelo hivishlish, from the time that it sprouts until it is a third. So therefore, that agrees with what we're saying Rabbi Meir holds, that if he cut it down when it was less than a third, then it's not a harvest, right? And so therefore, it separates the field. So bisman ad shelo hivishlish. But aval im hischil ad shelo hivishlish aser. But if it grows a third, so then it's prohibited. So we're not going to say Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir is going to hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. Now, problem is, Amar dishmas le Rabbi Yehuda lebehema. Well, 1 second. Before that, right? The problem is that. Oh, that's coming up. Sorry. Amar dishmas le Rabbi Yehuda lebehema. So he says, well, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that for an animal, right, you need to cut it less than a third. It's not harvesting, but he only says that when you're cutting it for an animal, not when you're cutting it for a human being. Dim kain havulo tilsa tanai. Because if that were the case, then you'd have 3 separate opinions. Because the Tanakama says you're cutting it for an animal, so then it's not harvesting. To which Rabbi Yehuda says, when is that true? When it isn't a third. Now, we have a rule, which is in Shas, that is whenever Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ei masai," when is that? He's not arguing, he's explaining. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Tanakama. And so therefore, the Tanakama is talking about when you're cutting it for animals. And Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda says it needs to be for less than a third. So how can you say Rabbi Meir is talking about when you're cutting it down even for people? So therefore, we still, right, Rabbi Meir in Maseches Peah, he can't hold like Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Meir says that you're right, even when you harvest it less than a third, if you're harvesting it less than a third, even for a person, that's not harvesting. So where does Rabbi Meir's shita fit in? Ella ki aser avdimi amar Rabbi Meir b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabo Amra. So we have to say that when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Meir is holding according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who was his teacher. Right, Rabbi Akiva was Rabbi Meir's teacher. Af le'adam nami lo havya katsir, but af le'adam nami lo havya katsir, which is that Rabbi Akiva holds that if you cut grain that's less than a third tall, then Rabbi Akiva holds that is not, even if you do it for a person, that's not considered harvesting. Right? Titanan, where do we see Rabbi Akiva holds? That way we're in the Mishnah. Ha-menamer sadeh. If you harvest portions of your field, menamer means make it spotted like a leopard, right? So you make it spotted. V'shir bo kalochim lachim, and you leave some of the fresh grain there, which has not fully grown. So Rabbi Akiva omer pe'ah l'chol echad ve'echad. Rabbi Akiva says, since you started cutting it down and it wasn't ripe yet, so it wasn't a third of the way grown, even though you're cutting it for a person, nevertheless, it separates the field, and now each patch that remains needs its own pe'ah. The Chachamim say me'echad al kol. No, it's still all one field, and you need one pe'ah for all of it. The Amar of Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda of Shmuel, lo chayev Rabbi Akiva ela b'minamer likloyos. The Rabbi Akiva is saying that this is talking about in a circumstance where the grain is being used for kloyos in order to make parched grain, right? Which is when it hasn't grown a third of the way. You harvest that, and that's less than a third of the way. But if you were harvesting it in order to store it as regular grain, then that would not be the halacha, because you'd be harvesting after a third, and after a third it would be a real harvest, in which case then the whole field would remain together. So now, that Rabbi Akiva is holding that harvesting this grain before it brings a third of the way, for the sake of a person, it's not harvesting. And therefore, that is the same as Rabbi Meir's shita as well. So, is that true though? V'ha ki asa Rabin, when Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said Rabbi Yochanan, Mechayev haya Rabbi Akiva af b'menamer l'otzer. He says Rabbi Akiva held that even if you harvest it for a person, but you're harvesting it and you harvest it after a third of the way, but you're cutting it down, that is still not considered a harvest. So that is not Rabbi Meir's shita. So the answer is Savar la kavase bechada upolig ale bechada. He agrees with one of the rules, but disagrees with the other. He holds like Rabbi Akiva that when you harvest something before it grows a third, so then it's not harvested, even if it's for the sake of a person. But he disagrees where Rabbi Akiva says that it is not harvesting if it is not ripe and has grown a third of the way. Where Rabbi Akiva says that also is not considered harvesting. Rabbi Meir says no. And once it grows a third of the way, that is considered harvesting. So he is his own opinion, but it is based on Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and so that's where Rabbi Akiva falls. Okay, so the place for us to end right here on Amud Beis, the beginning of today's daf.
Perfect.